All right, we are going to begin, and even though it's very quiet right now, we're going to start anyway. Hoping that a few people come in eventually. I know this is an odd time; it's 7 o'clock at night, and we are trying to make sure we finish before the summer begins. So tonight we're going to look at 27a, and I'm going to share the screen. Okay. All right, here we go. We're going to start where we finished. Bar Kapara. Darash Bar Kapara. Mai dichtiv v'yisrof et Beit Hashem ve'et Beit HaMelech ve'et kol batei Yerushalayim ve'et kol Beit Gadol saraf ba'esh. Let's get my glasses so I can see. Here's a verse from 2 Kings. What is the meaning of which is written? And he burnt the house of the Lord, the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great house he burnt with fire. So, okay, the house of the Lord, that we understand. Beit Hashem, that's the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. Beit HaMelech, Elu Paltarin Shel Melech, that's the king's palace. Kol Batei Yerushalayim, well, that's all the houses of Jerusalem. At kol Beit Gadol saraf ba'esh. What is the Beit Gadol? What is the great house that was burned with fire? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi disagreed, and one said, Makom shemegadlin bo Torah. One is a place where Torah is made great. It must be like a study hall. V'chad amar makom shemegadlin bo tefillah, in which prayer is made great. Okay, so two possibilities: a synagogue or a study hall. Which is the great house? Which is considered greater than the other, actually? Manda mar Torah. Okay, the one who says Torah, dichtiv Adonai chafetz leman sidko yagdil Torah v'yadir. The Lord was pleased for God's righteousness' sake to make Torah great and glorious. There you've got the word gadol right there. Must be, well, yagdil. Make great. Must be that. That must be a place where you study Torah. But the one who said that it was about tefillah, synagogue, he has a verse too. This is from 2 Kings chapter 8. Saprana hagdolot asher asa Elisha. Tell me, I pray you, all the great things that Elisha has done. Ve'Elisha da'avad b'rachamehu da'avad. What was the great thing that Elisha did? Remember, there's a story about Elisha, and he brings a boy back to life. He had promised, he had helped the family, the mother, the poor family, with the birth of a child. Promised them a birth of a child, and then the boy grew up, and he's still a little boy, and then he died. And the mother said, "Go get Elisha. He promised us a child, and then the kid dies." And Elisha came and restored the child to life. And he did it through prayer. And this is the great thing. This is the gadolot that Elisha did. All right. Tistayim de Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Hu de Amar Makom shebegadlin bo Torah. De Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Beit HaKnesset mutar la soto Beit HaMidrash shmamina. So, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is the one who said, because remember up here they're saying that they had this dispute and we didn't know who said what. It was Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. One of them took one of these positions. I mean, each one took one of these positions. But the Gemara assumes that it must be Yehoshua ben Levi who taught that the place of Torah was the great house, because Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi once said, it is permitted for a synagogue to be turned into a study hall. So therefore, if a synagogue can be turned into a study hall, and he doesn't say anything about a study hall being turned into a synagogue, then we have to assume that the study hall has a higher degree of sanctity. And so learn from this that he's the one who took that side in the argument. All right, next section. Aval machru Torah lo yikachu sfarim. This is from the Mishnah. If they sold a Torah scroll, they may not use the proceeds to purchase scrolls, that is, scrolls of the prophets or the writings. Remember that at this time, there's no books, and so sacred texts are written out on scrolls, and sometimes even the Torah scrolls are written out on individual books, prophets and writings similarly. So if you have a Torah scroll, and here I'm assuming that it is a full Torah scroll, all 5 books, if you sell it, you cannot purchase something of lesser sanctity, such as scrolls, from the prophetic or the section or the writing section. Mahulim kor sefer Torah yeshan likach bo chadash. Well, okay, what if you've got an old sefer Torah and you want to sell it and buy a new sefer Torah? So 2 possibilities. Kevan de loma alele asur, because you're not going higher in. It's one thing to go down. We know that you're not permitted in that case. The principle here is you can't go down in holiness and sanctity, so you can't sell a Torah scroll, highest level of sanctity, and purchase something of lesser sanctity. But what about the same level? So since it's the same level, is it forbidden because you're not going up in sanctity? O dilma kevanda lekala aluye iluyah acharina shapir dami. So, but on the other hand, if the Torah is the top, you can't go any higher. So maybe you can sell a Torah scroll for another Torah scroll. All right, so that's the question on the floor. Tashma, so come in here. Aval machru Torah lo yichu sfarim. All right, so we're going to go to the Mishnah to see if we can find a proof text evidence for one side or the other. If they sold a Torah scroll, they may not use the proceeds to purchase scrolls of lesser sanctity, prophets and writings. So therefore, you can infer, Torah b'Torah shapir dami, should be okay. Matnitin diavad kika miba'ayalan lechatchila. So it seems that's okay, except the Gemara is going to reject this argument because the Mishnah discusses machru. They sold, the Torah was already sold. So it's after the fact. But lechatchila, before, you can't have the Torah scroll and sell it with the intention, or that's the would be the argument. It's one thing to have, you already sold the Torah scroll. Oh my good, well, we sold it. We thought we weren't thinking. We sold it. Now we can only use the money. What do you use the money for? You got to use it for something. You buy another Torah scroll. That's okay, but because you can't buy anything of lesser sanctity. But if you were intending to sell the Torah scroll, you can't say, okay, we're going to sell this old scroll and buy a new one. That would be wrong. That's lechatchila. That's before the facts, or ab initio in the Latin. All right, so that doesn't hold. We don't have an answer yet. Tashma, okay, come in here. Gololin sefer Torah b'mit pachot chumashin v'chumashin b'mit pachot nevi'im uchtuvim aval lo nevi'im uchtuvim b'mit pachot chumashin v'lo chumashin b'mit pachot sefer Torah. All right, so this is a Baraita teaches that a Torah scroll can be wrapped in wrapping cloths from one of the 5 books. So if you had a full 5 books Torah scroll, you could take the sudar, the wrapping, and use it for from a let's say a Bereshit scroll that you have, a Genesis scroll or an Exodus scroll. You could take that wrapping and use it for wrapping an entire Torah scroll, because that sudar is moving up in holiness. Same thing goes if you had, but you could not use it for wrapping scrolls of the prophets, prophetic books, or books of the writings. And likewise, you could not take the wrapping, the sudar, of a Sefer Torah and wrap it around a separate single book of the Torah. You couldn't take the whole Torah scroll wrapping and then put it around the book of Genesis, because it's going down, it's lowering in sanctity. So, okay, so the assumption here is, okay, well, here we'll get to it. Katani mihat, golalin sefer Torah b'mitpachot chumashim in. You can wrap a sefer Torah in the sudar, in the wrapping cloth. Sometimes called wimple is a name for one version of the wrapping cloth that it's like a family heirloom. You can do that, but mitpachot chumashim. Wait. Golim sefer Torah mitpachot chumashim in mitpachot sefer Torah lo. So the inference here is a Torah scroll can be wrapped up only in wrapping cloths that are used for lesser sanctity. But to roll it up in wrapping cloths of another Torah scroll, no. Because one Torah, and so here the assumption is one Torah scroll cannot be sold in order to purchase another. So you can't move it. That horizontal sanctity doesn't work. Ema Seifa. Wait a minute, though. There's an objection here. If you look at the second half of the latter clause of the Baraita, v'lo chumashim b'mitpachot sefer Torah. Ha Torah b'Torah shapir dami. See, so the second half said you haven't really learned anything, because it doesn't say you can't wrap a sefer Torah in the wrapping of another Sefer Torah. It only said you couldn't go down in sanctity. You only go up in sanctity. But we still haven't reached a conclusion, because Torah to Torah, it's the same level of sanctity. So we can't really learn anything from here either. All right. Another possibility. Tashma, come in here. Manechin Sefer Torah al gabei Torah, v'Torah al gabei chumashim, v'chumashim al gabei nevi'im uchtuvim. A Torah scroll can be placed upon another Torah scroll. Let's see. They give an explanation. Why would you be doing that? No. Okay. We don't. I guess you're putting them in a container or something. You can put a Sefer Torah scroll on top of another one. Or a Torah can be placed upon separate chumashim. And scrolls of the chumashim can be placed upon scrolls of the prophets or writings. Once again, we see higher to lower sanctity. The higher, something of a higher sanctity can be placed on something of lower sanctity. But you can't go the opposite direction. And Steinsaltz tells us from the first clause, it's apparent that one Torah scroll may be used for the sake of another. So here, we have an argument for selling one Torah for the sake of another. But then the Gemara rejects this proof too. Hanacha kamart, you're talking about putting one Torah scroll on top of the other? Shani hanacha de lo efshar. The halakha of placing scrolls upon one another is different, because it's impossible to place them any other way. And the example is when we roll a Torah scroll, we are putting a passage, a yiriyah, that's the sheet of Torah scroll that the columns are written on. You're placing, when you roll it up, you're placing one scroll, one yiriyah on another yiriyah. And there'd be no way to roll it up if you couldn't roll a Torah onto a Torah. So maybe that doesn't teach us anything. It's impossible to furl the scroll in any other way. So it's permitted here too, since it's impossible to place scrolls in the ark in any other way. It's permitted, but you can't really learn. Once again, we don't have a definitive answer of whether you can sell a scroll for another Torah scroll. Everything seems to be, that's the only way you can do it in terms of rolling up. So that's thrown out. Another possibility, Tashma. Damar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, Rabba Bar Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who spoke in the name of or taught this in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Lo yimkor adam sefer Torah yashan likach bo chadash. You may not sell, a person may not sell an old Torah scroll to purchase a new one. Well, that seems to be the end of the matter. Here, that's a baraita that was in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. But we're not done yet. The Gemara rejects this too. Hatam mishum pshiyuta. There, in the case of the baraita, it's prohibited because of negligence. Ki amrinan kigon dichtiv umanach leif rokei mai. See, the concern here is what again, we're talking about tenses and after the fact and before the fact. Shimon ben Gamliel is saying that you can't sell it with the intention of buying a new scroll, because what if the new scroll is not written? You hire somebody, or you say you're going to hire somebody and buy the new scroll, so you sell the old one and you never get around to buying the new one. That's the concern. That's what they're suggesting is the concern here. That's what they mean by negligence. But what about dichtiv umanach leifrokei? But what if it was written and just waiting to be sold? What about that case? So maybe if you're unprepared, you've got, hold on. Oh, okay. Then we, in that case, maybe it's, you've signed the contract and so it's not a question. Well, what about the halakha in that case? Could you sell an old Torah scroll and buy a new one? Maybe it's okay. All right. Tashma de Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Meir. Here, Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Meir, Ein mochrin sefer Torah, ela lilmod Torah, velisa isha. The only reason, according to Rabbi Meir, that you can sell a Torah scroll is if the seller needs money in order to study Torah or to marry a woman. See, these are the two, again, we're going to see in the next couple of pages, these valuations, this hierarchy of values for the rabbi. Torah study is number one, that's top. But there are other values too that sometimes conflict and are on par with, in certain cases, certain exceptional cases. Not as a general rule, but maybe an exceptional situation. And in this case, studying Torah and marrying. Those are two very important values. Studying Torah is at the top, but marrying is also essential. So, Shema Mina. So, let's learn from this baraita about exchanging one Torah for another. Torah b'Torah shapir dami. A Torah for another Torah is okay. Dilma shane limud shehalimud mevi lidei maaseh. But this is a situation in which you can't say it's just any time you buying a Torah scroll and then sticking it in your ark in the synagogue, because this was a special case. This is what we're learning from Rabbi Meir is here it's for learning, and learning leads to observance. So if you're selling a Torah scroll in order to study Torah and having a Torah scroll to study, that study tool, not that in other words, not that we're calling Torah a tool, but that study opportunity will lead a person to greater observance. And in the case of Isha Nami, lo tohu v'ra'a l'shevet yatzara. He created human beings not as a waste, he formed it to be inhabited. The it here is creation. Lo tohu, not chaos, like tohu vavohu in the creation story. Lo tohu bara'a, he didn't create the world to be a place of tohu. That's what God was doing the opposite of. He was changing the tohu into something. So he wanted it to be a place, Leshevet Yitzhara, that it would be inhabited, or there would be a place of, he Yatzar Ota, he created it, Leshevet, for dwelling. This indicates that marrying and having children fulfills a primary goal of creation. But selling an old Torah scroll to buy a new Torah scroll, still don't have a solution. Still don't know. So it's one thing to buy a Torah scroll in order to learn more Torah, but to just have it, it's not so clear. Tanu Rabbanan, lo yikor adam sefer Torah afal pisha einot tzarich lo. Yater al kain amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, afilu ein lo ma yochal umachar sefer Torah ovito eino roeh siman bracha leolam. Here's another baraita which suggests the opposite. A person should not sell a Torah scroll ever, even if he doesn't need it. I don't know why you wouldn't need a Torah scroll. I can't think of let's see. The early commentaries record two different versions of the Gemara here. The first version states, even if he does not need it, meaning he already has another Torah scroll. Okay. The other version has, even if he has a need for it, meaning he has no money and needs the proceeds from the sale of Torah to buy necessities, which seems to follow that interpretation, maybe a little bit more correct in terms of what follows. Because on top of that, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, this was from the rabbis, sages, then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, taught afilu ein lo ma yochal, even if you don't have anything to eat, and all you've got is the Sefer Torah, or your daughter, which people would sell their daughters into servitude. Nothing good can come of that. Even if you are starving and you need money to eat and save yourself, to save a Torah scroll, to put your daughter into servitude, that will not, there is no benefit coming from that. You might get a meal out of it, maybe get a week of meals out of it, a month of meals out of it, but in the end, it's going to be horrible. It's not going to be it won't be a bracha to you. It won't be a blessing. Okay, and that's the end of our discussion. And like very often in Talmud, there's no resolution. We got a lot of arguments. We saw a lot of different points of view, but there's no final resolution to this question, the Gemara. And I think that is sometimes what the rabbis mean is for the sake of arguing. That it's a value, there's a value in the back and forth and the learning that comes out of it. Sometimes, which is really actually a beautiful teaching, it's not about who wins and who loses. It's not about the resolution. It's about the journey. It's about the learning and hearing the different points of view. It's the debate. The debate is the fun part. That's where Torah is really found. If you have a conclusion, obviously somebody's got to come up with a conclusion because you got to live your life. But you can have different conclusions. Different rabbis will come to different solutions, and that's okay. But what's really valuable is the debate and the journey through Torah study. Okay. V'chein b'motrehen. Now we're back to the Mishnah. If there's surplus funds from your sale, you sell, again, a Torah scroll, you sell one of the Chumashim, one of the scrolls of the books, of the singular 5 books. You sell a scroll of the prophets, and in order to purchase something sacred, but you have money left over. Amar Rava, lo shanu ela shemachru v'hotiru, aval gavu v'hotiru mutar. So Rava says they taught that the surplus funds have sanctity only in a case where the community sold a sacred object and then used the proceeds to purchase something with a greater degree of sanctity, and there was money left over. However, if the community collected money from its members in order to purchase a sacred object, and there was extra money left over beyond the price of the object, that extra money is permitted to be used for any purpose. So, You have right. We're talking about an ark. So you have an ark, and you sell the ark, and you get $100 for it, and you buy a new ark, or you buy what was the thing you could I forgot already what you could buy with the ark, but what is something of lesser sanctity? I think the synagogue was of lesser sanctity. The ark was higher sanctity, and you buy a, buy a really inexpensive synagogue for $50. Okay, you got $50 left over. Well, you still got to you could only use that $50 for something of that sacred level. However, if you collect, say we're going to buy a new ark, and where our goal is $100, and you raise $150, that extra $50, you can buy anything with it. You're not stipulated. It's not stipulated to purchase the sacred stuff. Um, let's see. Here's the halacha. If money is collected in order to buy a sacred object, and the community wishes to use the money for something else, they may use it only in order to purchase something of similar or greater degree of sanctity. The exception to this is when the funds were collected by 7 representatives of the town, we've seen that before, in an assembly of the residents of the town. If money was collected and there is money left over from the purchase, some say that the community may purchase with those funds whatever they see fit. So now notice this is a little bit different. The halakha as it stands is slightly different. Here they're saying you collected money to buy something. You collected money to buy a new ark. And the community wishes to use the money for something. Oh, okay. Now this is a little bit different. They're not talking about leftover money. It says, and the community wishes to use the money for something else. So you said we're going to buy an ark, and then somebody, I don't know, somebody gives you one. And the community then wishes to use that $150 you raised. You have to use it for the sacred purpose. You can't just say, oh, well, we got a new ark. We'll just go and buy, chairs for the sanctuary. Can't do that. You have to buy something that with the purpose that you collected the money for. So it's a little bit different from what we're talking about here, which is the difference between surplus funds from a sale and surplus, an overage from a collection. All right. Eitvei Abaye. במה דברים אמורים שלא היתנו, אבל היתנו אפילו לדוך סוסיה mutar. So Abaye disagrees with Rava, and he brings in a baraita. In what case is this statement of the Mishnah said when they did not explicitly stipulate that they would do what they would do with the surplus? So if they did not stipulate what they were going to do with the surplus funds as they see fit, if they did not explicitly stipulate that they could use it for anything, then this is what the halacha over here is talking about. Then they're obligated to use it for a sacred something. But if they made a stipulation, then even to use the money for a duchsusia, which we'll get to in a second, it's permitted. If they made a stipulation that said anything over $100, we can just use it for whatever we want. Hechidami, so this is what he said. Ilema shemachru v'hotiru ki hitnu mayhave. What are the circumstances of this stipulation? If we say that they sold a sacred object and after using the proceeds to purchase another sacred object, there was money left over, then even when they made a stipulation, of what avail is it? How can a stipulation desanctify money? Rather, the Mishnah must be referring to a case where they collected money to purchase a sacred object, and there was money left over after they made the purchase. In such a case, the reason that it is permitted to use the extra money for any purpose is that they made an explicit stipulation. The heat knew. However, if they did not make a stipulation, no, it would not be permitted. So if they said, again, if they explicitly said any money over what we collect, we'll use it for some other purpose, then it's okay. Rava rejects this. Leolam shemachru v'hotiru v'hachi ka'amar. Now he's going to reread that baraita in such a way to make his case. You can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a case where they sold a sacred object and there was money left over after purchasing a new one. And this is what the Baraita is saying. In what case is the statement of the Mishnah said? In a case where the 7 representatives of the town did not explicitly stipulate that they could use the money as they see fit in an assembly of the town. However, if the 7 representatives of the town made such a stipulation in an assembly of the residents of the town, that even to use the money for a duchsusia, I think Phil Collins wrote a song about that, would also be permitted. Okay, so he's saying exactly what the halacha is over here. If they made a stipulation, if the 7 representatives of the town, these are like the 7 managers, in an assembly, in a case where they did not explicitly stipulate that they could use the money as they see fit. But if they did make such a stipulation, then even to so that's what he's saying. In that case, where they made a stipulation, that actually sounds a lot like Abaye, except that he's saying that the 7 representatives of the town are the ones who make that stipulation. Okay. Amar le Abaye, lahahu me Rabbanan dehava misader matnita kamei de Rav Sheshet. So this is good. He wants to know what duchsusia means. And Abaye goes to the Hava Misader, one of the rabbis who Hava Misader Matnita Kame de Rav Sheshet. So this is an interesting thing about the little realia of the Talmudic world and the academies. Somebody who arranges the Mishnah. So again, you don't have books at this period of time. You have people who are memorizing the Mishnah and Baraitas, and they just memorize it. And actually, that's where the word Tana comes from. These are Amoraim, these are Talmudic period rabbis. But nevertheless, a Tana was somebody who memorized the Mishnah and would be able to, he'd be like Google. He'd be like human Google. And so they'd be sitting in the academy and they'd say, so-and-so, what's the Mishnah on X? And then he would recite it. So Abaye, who wants to know what the word duchsusia means, goes to the person in Rav Sheshet's academy who's responsible for arranging the Mishnayot and probably sharing, teaching them. Whenever they needed to know the text, he would share the text by memory. So he goes, Mi shemialach me Rav Sheshet mai duchsusia. Did you ever learn from Rav Sheshet what the meaning of a duchsusia was? And Marle, Hachi Amar Rav Sheshet, Parasha de Mata. It's the town horseman who would carry dispatches back and forth. So that's what a duchsusia. So you could even spend the money on something like that, very pragmatic matter, having nothing to do with sacred objects. But if you made the stipulation that anything collected over this amount, we can use it for whatever we wish. You could even do it for something like that, which clearly has no sacred purpose. And then we close with a little lesson. Amar Abaye Hilkach Hayit Surba Mirabanan Dishmale Milta Veloya da Perusha Lishaila Kame Dishchiach Kame Rabanan. A young Torah scholar who's heard something and doesn't know the meaning of it, you hear something, you're not so clear, you know what you should do? You should inquire from somebody who hangs out with great rabbis. Delo efshar, delo shemiale min gavra rabba. Because it's impossible that a person who is constantly learning, constantly around great scholars, they're picking stuff up. And if you're a young scholar and you want to know something, go talk to the people who study with the great ones and they'll be able to give you the information. All right, next section. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Meir, Bnei Ha'ir shehalchu la'ir acheret ufasku aleihen tzedakah notnin ukeshehein ba'in mevi'in ota imahen umefarnesin ba aniyei Iran. Rabbi Meir taught, in the case of residents of a town who collectively went to another town, so the whole group of people go to another town, and they're charity collectors constantly, there are all types of communal charities, and they're in town for a while, and the collectors come to them, and they pledge a certain amount of tzedakah. They give the tzedakah, but when they leave, they get the money back in order to finance the poor of their own town. It's really a very interesting concept. It's like, well, if you're going to get the money back, why would you give it in the first place? But I guess the possibility, first of all, you want to be good guys. You're visiting a town and you want to participate in the community collection. Another possibility is, maybe you don't go back to your own town and maybe you just stay in this new town, and so you participate. But if you go back, you get, it's like when you in Israel, what's that, VAT? You get the VAT as you're leaving the country, the extra tax you paid that's only for the residents of the country. And you get the VAT back, and then you can take it. But in this case, you got to give it to the poor people of your own town. And then we have another baraita, Tanya Nami Hachi, Bnei Ha'ir shehalchu la'ir acheret ufasku aleihen tzedakah notnin ukeshe Hein ba'in mivi'in ota imahen. Case of residents of a town who collectively went to another town, and while there, the local charity collectors made them pledge a certain amount for tzedakah. Well, they have to give it up, but when they go home, they get to take it. However, v'yachid shehalach li'ir acheret ufasku aleihen tzedakah tinatei la'aniyei ota ha'ir. But an individual, when he's in this new town for temporarily, and the charity collectors come and make it force him, but he has to make a pledge, a certain sum for charity. He has to give a certain amount of charity while he's in this town. He's living there. He's got to participate in the communal tzedakah. When he leaves that town, he does not get the money back. It stays in the town. I don't know exactly the difference between the community, and I don't think he had any notes on that. No, I don't really understand the difference between the individual and the community, but an individual and a group of people, unless it's the amount of money that we're talking about, or you don't trust that the individual is going to give it to the charity in his own town. I'm not so sure. Okay, Rav Huna. Okay, so here we have a case situation. Rav Huna Gazar Tanita al Gabe Rav Chana Bar Hanilai v'chol b'nei Matei. So Rav Huna declared a Tanit, a fast day, and they were collecting tzedakah for it. And Rav Chana Bar Hanilai and the people of his town came because it was this fast day, this regional fast day, and they came and Ramolei ha'u tzedakah v'yahavu, and like we saw above, they came, the collectors came to them, they raised some funds, the people of Rav Chana Bar Chanilai's town gave the money to the collectors. Ki ba'u lemeiti, when they were ready to go back home, Amarule, they said, okay, Notva lan mar v'nezul unifarnes ba anye matin. Give us back the money we gave you so we can go and give it to the poor of our town. Now here, of course, is so interesting because we just learned that in the Baraita it says one thing, group, they get the money back and then they give it to the poor of their community. But if an individual, he has to give the charity of the town he's in. That's not what Rav Huna says. Amar lahu, Rav Huna says to him, Tanena b'med dvarim amurim, b'she'ein sham chaver ir. That ruling above, that's only in the case where you don't have an important scholar of the town who is collecting money and is responsible to make sure that the needy of his community give. Aval yesham chaver ir, but if there is a scholar in the town, that's me, Rav Huna, tinatein lechaver ir, you have to give it to that person. You don't get the money back. V'chol shekein da aniyei didi v'didchu al smichi. And he says, on top of that, actually, I'm also kind of the regional collector, because the poor of your town and the poor of my town all depend on me. And so therefore, it's really the money that I collected from you, or that our collectors collected from you, it's actually all going to the same place because I'm responsible for the whole area. So in that case, you don't get your money back because it's going to be used for the appropriate purpose in all these outline areas. Okay, new Mishnah. Ein mochrin et shel rabim liyachid mibnei shemoridin oto mikdu shato. You may not sell a sacred object belonging to the community to an individual, and it says here in the notes, even if it's to be used for the same purpose, due to the fact that by doing so, it downgrades its degree of sanctity. That is, before we saw it was the object, the sacred object or there's a hierarchy of sacred objects. Torah is at the top. Anything connected to the Torah, Ark, Bima, then the synagogue, then the town square. So it's a leveling of holiness of objects. Here, it's the quantity of people is also a factor in holiness. Let's see what he says here. In the Jerusalem Talmud, there is a discussion about the opinion of Rabbi Meir. It concludes that his ruling pertains not to the sale of a synagogue, but rather to the sale of a Torah scroll that is used by the community. The Raavad explains in Tamim De'im that the sanctity of a synagogue is to be viewed in some aspects as though it were inherent. The Ramban, that's Nachmanides, explains similarly as such, even when its sanctity is transferred through a sale, it nevertheless retains a certain degree of sanctity. All right, well, we're going to get to that in a moment. This whole idea of that sanctity seems to be an objective quality that goes somewhere when we transfer objects. Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't finish the Mishnah here. Divrei Rabbi Meir. So this is Rabbi Meir's opinion, that you can't sell an object that is used by the majority or a number of people to a singular person. That causes a lowering of sanctity. Amru lo, they said to him, the majority said to him, Im kain af lo me'ir gedolah le'ir ketana. According to your theory, then you couldn't sell a Torah, anything of sacred value from a big city to a small city. The small cities are going to get screwed over by you because you're saying that the sanctity depends on size, on quantity. It's we in South Bend already have a chip on our shoulder about those big Jewish communities. What are you going to say, that Chicago is a holier place than South Bend because they got more people? What are you talking about? Okay, so here's the Gemara. Shapir ka'amri le Rabbanan le Rabbi Meir. That the majority's response to Rabbi Meir, the Gemara is telling us, is a good one. But of course, we didn't hear Rabbi Meir's response. That's not recorded here, just his opinion. So they're going to fill in. The Rabbi Meir, what he could have said was, Meir gedolah le'ir kitana, from a big city to a small city, Meikara kadisha, hashtanami kadisha. There's no significant downgrade in degree of sanctity, as at the outset it was sacred, and it's still sacred. Me'rabim liyachid, though, leka kedusha. But when it is transferred from a community to an individual, there is a significant downgrade in this degree of sanctity, as there is no longer this degree of sanctity that existed before. So his argument is 100 people and 10 people. it's still a minyan, right? You still have a community of Jews, and there is no difference between one community and another community. Once you have community, but community to an individual, oh yeah, well then certainly the holiness, the sanctity is lessened. It's an interesting argument. But well, let's see what the Rabbanan respond. The Rabbanan, if you're concerned about that, ki hai gavna nami ikala mechash. In a case like this as well, when it's transferred to a smaller community, because we have this verse, Birov am hadrat melech, in the multitude of people is the king's glory. The more people, the more glory for God. The verse teaches that the larger the assembly involved in a mitzvah, the greater the honor to God. However, it's apparent that this principle does not prevent the sale of a synagogue to a smaller community, and therefore it should not prevent the selling of a synagogue to an individual. So the Rabbanan still seem to be holding that you can sell to an individual, whether it's a synagogue, whether it's a sacred object. And of course, today's world, that's a significant thing because a lot of holy items or valuable items of Judaica are sold and hoarded by personal collectors. And instead of being able to be part of maybe a museum or some kind of a collection that's open so that people can see it, these guys with lots of money, I don't even think they're always Jewish, hold on to this stuff. And then, as an investment. And that just seems wrong. So it's an interesting argument we have today. The rabbis seem to be suggesting, at least in the context here, that you could sell it to an individual, that individuals did. And we saw an example before where rabbis purchased a synagogue, and that became kind of their place to study, pray, live in. Okay, next Mishnah. Ein mochrim beit knesset ela al tanai she'im yiratzu yachziruhu. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Okay, Rabbi Meir's opinion is you can't sell a synagogue, or you can only sell a synagogue with a stipulation that if the sellers so desire it, the buyers will return it to them. So you're really kind of hard to sell sacred stuff, synagogue, at least, because who's going to buy something if Sinai Synagogue sells its building and the rule is, well, we can always get it back. It makes the sale a little iffy. But the rabbis say, okay, rabbis disagreeing with Rabbi Meir again, Mochrino to mimkar olam. You can sell it, it's a permanent sale. Chutz meba'ar arba'a dvarim. They do have some limitations. You can't sell it in 4 cases. You can't sell it to a public bath, or a tannery, a burski, or a what's the difference between, well, it's a mikvah, but what's the difference? Well, okay, I guess, yeah. A ritual bath, a mikvah, or a bathhouse, either one, even though a mikvah is a sacred place, you'd think, and a beit hamayim, and a lavatory. So the rule here is something smelly or where people are walking around naked. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mochrin ota l'shem chatzer, v'halokeach ma sheyirtzeh yaseh. So Rabbi Yehuda has an interesting approach. He says, you sell it as you're selling the property, the land for a field, for a courtyard. Chatzer is a courtyard. You sell it for a courtyard. You say, oh yeah, we're going to sell you this synagogue as long as you turn it into a courtyard. That's fine, not a problem. And then once the sale is done, okay, basically you can do whatever you want with it. It's yours. It belongs to you. So you could even turn it into a bathhouse. So we had 3 different opinions. Now we get to the Gemara. Rabbi Meir, hechi dairiba. How may those who purchased the synagogue live in it? Because Oh, right. Here's the issue. Let's say you sell it. Let's say we sell Sinai Synagogue, and somebody wants to buy. Like, oh no, let's use B'nai, the sons of Israel. So they sell the sons of Israel, and they turn it into the Cubs store. Um, and according to Rebbe Meir, if the Sons of Israel community says, after a year or two, the Cubs were selling stuff in it, they say we want it back. So let's say they're living in it, they didn't buy it for, which actually they did, right? I think originally, before they turned it into the Cub store, it was bought by a guy who was going to turn it into a beautiful home. Okay, but the synagogue can get it back anytime it wants, according to Rebbe Meir. So the problem is you can't sell for there's no interest taking in Judaism, at least with fellow Jews. So if I sell it to the guy who wants to turn it into a house, and he lives in it, and then he gives it back to me, hasn't, in a sense, it's not interest in terms of money, but he got benefit from it when from the sale, right? Isn't that? I think that's what he's saying. If the sellers demand the synagogue's return, the payment given for it would be returned to the buyers. The sum of money may be considered as a loan given from the buyers to the sellers until the synagogue was demanded back. The buyers, so the guy living in the house benefited from giving that loan by being able to live in the synagogue building. But gaining any benefit from a loan is prohibited as interest. So he got this free time to live in it, right? He gives the synagogue back. The synagogue gives the money back, but he, in the meantime, benefited from it. So that sounds like interest taking, even though it's not the usual way we think of interest. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Meir b'shitat Rabbi Yehuda Amara. So Rabbi Meir was following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said uncertain interest. Where's our text here? A case of uncertain interest occurs when the lender's chance of receiving any return on his loan is dependent on various circumstances and is not guaranteed. So the guy who bought the Sons of Israel, Sons of Israel had the right, according to Rebbe Meir, to get it back, but maybe they weren't going to get it back because the Sons of Israel community, they didn't really exist anymore. They either belonged to, they joined Sinai, they joined Temple, they moved out of the area. They didn't really have, there was no chance the Sons of Israel was going to reconstitute itself as a synagogue, and therefore the likelihood that they were going to ask for the synagogue back was basically nil. So it's uncertain interest, and that's permissible. Okay, that's what Rabbi Meir is thinking, because he's following Rabbi Yehuda. All right. The Tanya, Shehaya nosei b'chavero maneh ve'asa lo sadehu mecher bizman shemocher ochel perot mutar lokeach ochel perot asur. Okay, let's go through this. In the case of the Mishnah, the sale might never be undone, and then there would be no loan to speak of. It should be, right, the sale would have been permanent. It should therefore be permitted as a case of uncertain interest, as it is taught in a baraita. If one had a debt of 100 dinars against his fellow, and the borrower made a conditional sale of his field, because he did not have any money to repay the loan, stipulating that if he later comes into possession of money with which to repay the loan, the field reverts back to his ownership. Then as long as the seller of the field consumes the produce, it's permitted, right? Because he was hoping to get it back. So any food that he was eating from it was a temporary, it was conditional. So he can keep eating it. However, if the buyer consumes the produce, the arrangement is prohibited. As if the sale were to be reverted, then the money given for it would be considered a loan from the buyer to the seller, and therefore any benefit the buyer gains due to the loan should be prohibited as interest, right? So he buys it, but in the end he's going to give it back. He's going to let the seller take it back, buy it back, So if he's eating the fruit from the field, it's interest that he's it's a benefit he's gaining from having the field, and that's considered to be interest. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, afilu lokeach ochel perot mutar. Now Rabbi Yehuda says, this is again who Rabbi Meir is following, even if the buyer consumes the produce, it's permitted, since it is possible the sale might never be undone, in which case there would be no loan to speak of. It is a case of uncertain interest. See, because the seller, maybe he'll never get the 100 manah to buy the field back. It's possible, but not certain. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that isn't really what interest is. And Rabbi Yehuda said there was an incident involving Beitos ben Zunin, who made a conditional sale of his field in a similar arrangement under the direction of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and the buyer was consuming the produce in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And the rabbi said to him, do you seek to bring a proof from there? So there they disagree with him. In that case, it was actually the seller who was consuming the produce and not the buyer. So you had the story wrong. So you can't use that example because in that case, the seller was consuming the produce and that's not considered interest. Okay. My banaihu. Sarechad beribit ika banaihu. What's the practical difference between them? The permissibility of uncertain interest is the difference. One sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds that uncertain interest is permitted, and one sage, that is the rabbis, hold that uncertain interest is prohibited. Okay, so then that little story about Beitos ben Zunin, that's the difference, was this issue of uncertain interest. Last piece here on the interest. Rava said a different explanation of the dispute. According to, and Rava is again, these guys are Tanaim, they're rabbis of the Mishnaic period, and Rava is later. Rava said a different explanation of the dispute. According to everyone, uncertain interest is prohibited. So everybody agrees that uncertain interest is prohibited, like the majority. And here it is the question of the permissibility of interest given on the condition that it will be returned that is the practical difference between them. In addition to the arrangement described in the Braita, the parties in this case agreed that the buyer would consume the produce. That was part of the agreement. If the sale would later be reverted, then the buyer would reimburse the seller for the value of the produce. He ate 50 apples while we were waiting on, the seller was trying to collect money to buy back a field. 50 apples, I owe you 10 cents an apple, and so I didn't get any interest. I didn't take any interest. One sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds that interest that is given on condition that it will be returned is permitted. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you didn't have to pay it back. This is because even if the sale is reverted and the sale becomes a loan retroactively, the buyer lender will not benefit from that loan since he reimbursed the seller borrower for the value of the produce. But the sages, the majority, hold that it's prohibited. So in this case, Rava's understanding is, and in this case, what Rav Yehuda is saying is that because the guy's going to pay you back. If the sale is reverted, he'll pay you for the apples. But the rabbis hold even beforehand, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to make use of those apples. Okay. You can sell a synagogue if it's a permanent sale. Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Mutar l'adam l'hashtin mayim b'toch arba amot shel tefillah. Okay, here's another halacha, what's going to be connected to synagogue life. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said it is permitted for a person to urinate within 4 cubits of where he has just offered prayer. 4 cubits is like 6 feet. So hopefully that's not talking about inside the synagogue. I think that would be really inappropriate. We're talking about just a place of prayer. So it's just kind of interesting that And we'll get to that. Okay. All right. So you're not supposed to pray too close to where something smelly or dirty is. But 6 feet is okay. That's what Shmuel is saying. Or actually, let's do it the opposite way. 6 feet within, the person prays, has to go to the bathroom, and there are no, it's not like there's a lot of public, there's no indoor plumbing. So wherever you're praying, you can walk at least, you got to walk at least 6 feet away, and then you can urinate. So you shouldn't urinate right where you prayed. All right. Rav Yosef said, Rav Yosef, my kamashmal, what's the lesson here? Tanena, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mochrin ota l'shum chatzer, v'lokeach mashi yirtzeh ya'aseh. Here we're back to that Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda said, you can sell a synagogue with the stated objective of selling it as the chatzer, the courtyard. And then once it's sold, you can use it for anything. So v'afilu Rabbanan lo ka'amrei. Yeah, and here Steinsaltz points out, yeah, so even to make it as a lavatory, so you could, so there was a place where it was a building that was dedicated to prayer. Guy buys it with this little ruse, and he turns it into a public bathroom. Seems, we've already learned that that's okay. So what's the message that Shmuel is teaching us, that you can urinate within 4 cubits of where prayer is offered? And even the rabbis, he goes on, afilu Rabbanan lo kamrei ela beit haKnesset tekvia kedushatei aval arba amot lo kvia kedushatei lo. The rabbis, according to them, ruling only with regard to a synagogue whose sanctity is permanent. However, with regard to the 4 cubits of where one happens to stand in prayer, the sanctity is not permanent. See, so again, on the one hand, you've got Rabbi Yehuda, who says, you could sell the building somehow, and then they could turn it into a public bathroom. And then what's the big deal? Shmuel just said you can't, you got to distance yourself from between prayer and urination. But here you've got a synagogue that's turned into a bathroom. And the rabbis even, who say, yeah, we're only talking about a synagogue because the synagogue has fixed, they disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. They say, no, of course you couldn't sell it for a lavatory, but that's a synagogue. If you're just standing in the field praying, you can move away from it. You can move away from the place you just prayed, and then urinate. That would be okay. So what's the point that they're trying to tell us? Tane Tana Kamei what's the point of what Shmuel's teaching is? It seems pretty obvious. Tane Tana Kamei de Rav Nachman. Okay, so a Tana taught a Baraita before Rav Nachman. Here's that Tana guy again. The Tana is the one who's got all this stuff memorized, and he teaches before Rav Nachman this Baraita. Hamid Palel Marchik Arba Amot Mashtin. One who prays has to distance himself 4 amot, 6 feet, and then he can urinate. The Hamashtin, and a person who's urinating, has to distance himself 4 amot, 6 feet, before he can pray. So Amarle, Rav Nachman said to him, Bishlama Hamashtin Marchik Arba Amot Umid Palel. Granted the second clause of the Braita, that one who urinated should distance himself 4 cubits, and only then may he pray, because we learned in a Mishnah in Brachot, Kama Yarchik mehen from urine. How far should you distance yourself from urine and from feces, excrement, before you pray? And it says in that Mishnah, at least 6 feet. Ella Hamit Paleel Marchik Arba Amot Umashtin Lamali. But the one who prayed, why does he need to distance himself from 6 feet before he goes to the bathroom? Why do you need to require this? Because he says, if that's the rule, Kidashtinhu lekulahu shvile de Nahar. In this town of Nehar Da'ah, this is one of the great Talmudic cities in Babylonia, every inch of space people pray. There's nowhere that people are not praying. We're a lot of pious people around here. People are praying all the time. They never be able to go to the bathroom because every inch of the town has been prayed on. According to this halacha, it should be prohibited to urinate everywhere. So, this is kind of interesting because the way he's understanding it is not immediately. It's not like I prayed the morning service and then I walked a couple of feet and urinated. He's thinking that the area of that each area, once you pray in it, you've somehow like made that space holy. And how could you say, oh, just walk a few, that you can't urinate unless you walk away from that 6 feet away, because there's nowhere that isn't within 6 feet of a prayerful spot. So then the Gemara says, okay, so amend it and teach the Baraita as saying not that one should distance oneself 4 cubits, but that one should wait the time it takes to 4 cubits. I'm not really sure how that solves the problem, but okay. Bishlama mashtin yishaheh kedei hiluch arba amot. Granted, in the second clause, that one who urinated waits the time it takes to walk 4 cubits, and only then should he pray, makes sense. Mishum nitzotzot. That the term nitzotzot is usually understood as sparks when you talk about Kabbalistic stuff, but here he's talking about droplets, right? So a person goes to the bathroom, he's still, maybe something is still dropping out. And therefore you should wait a little bit. You should not pray immediately after you've urinated. You need a little space, at least you need a little bit of time, a few minutes, the amount of time to walk the 6 feet. Well, maybe not a few minutes, maybe it's a little bit of time. I don't even know, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. However, with regard to the first clause, the one who prayed should wait the time it takes to walk 4 cubits and only then urinate. Why should I require that? Because for all the time it takes, because you finish praying, right? You finish praying and you're done. Now you should be able to relieve yourself. But Rav Ashi says because the time it takes to walk 4 cubits, that short amount of time, prayer is still in one's mouth and his lips are still articulating them. I think it's a really interesting notion about what prayer is. When you finish praying, when you say the last word, you're still kind of in prayer mode. And there should be a little bit of distance, a little break in time between your conclusion of prayer and you're relieving yourself. Interesting. Okay. Now we're going to get, we get a little siman of Zalpan. It's a mnemonic device because we're going to learn about 4 rabbis, Zayin, Lamed, Ped, Nun, Zakai, Elazar, La, Parida, Pei, and Nechunya for Nun. Okay. What's this issue? Sha'alu Talmidav et Rabbi Zakai, and it's connected to what we just had. B'meherachta yamim. Why have you, what's the reason for your long life? And Rabbi Zakai, the students asked him this. He said to them, Miyamai lo hishtanti mayim betoch arba amot shel tefillah. See, he said, I followed this rule that we just talked about. I've never urinated within 6 feet of where I prayed. So that's a good thing. So therefore he got long life. V'lo kiniti shem lechaveri. I never called any of my friends a nickname because a lot of times that can end up being something derogatory. V'lo bitalti kiddush hayom. And I always say kiddush on Shabbat after lunch. After services, after morning services. I always make kiddush. Ima zakena haitali. I had an elderly mother. Pamachat machra kippah sheberosha vehevia li kiddush hayom. She sold the kerchief. Kippah is what we usually use now for the head covering, like a yarmulke. But here kippah means head covering for a woman, which in this case is a kerchief. Handkerchief, or some kind of kerchief. Yeah, know what it's called. And therefore, and with it, she brought me wine for kiddush. Tana, kishemeta Hinicha lo shalosh me'od garv be yayin. When she died, she left him 300 barrels, right, 300 barrels of wine to make sure he never ran out of Kiddush. But when he died, he left to his children 3,000 barrels of wine. So this was a really big mitzvah for him. Rav Huna hava asar rita v'ka'e kame de Rav. Rav Huna was girded with a piece of straw and was standing before Rav. And Rav said to him, "What's this? Why are you dressed that way?" He said to him, "I had no wine for sanctifying Shabbat during the day, Kiddush Hayom, so I pawned my belt, and with the proceeds, I brought wine for sanctifying the day." Rav said to him, "May it be God's will that you be enveloped in silk in reward for such dedication." So he blesses him. Now, we have a story about how that blessing came true. Ki ich kalal Rabba berei, Rav Huna inish gutzahava. When Rabba, his son, was married, Rav Huna, who was a short man, so this is the son of Rav Huna. Rabba was a short man. He was lying on a bed, and nobody noticed him, a little couch or something. And his daughters and daughters-in-laws came into the room, and they threw off their silk garments, and they threw it on the bed, on the couch or whatever, and they didn't see he was sitting there. So literally, he was enveloped in silk. The blessing came true. When Rav heard about this, he got a little ticked off because he said, "Hey, what's the reason when I blessed you, you didn't respond in kind and say to me, and likewise to you, Master, because maybe I'd also benefited from that blessing. Thanks a lot, buddy. Could have helped me out." All right. Shalu Talmidav Shal et Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. This is to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. How have you lived? Well, what's the reason for your long life? Amar lahem miyamai lo asiti kapandaria leveta knesset. I never made the Beit Knesset a shortcut. I never, to save time, I never ran through the synagogue. V'lo pasati al roshei am kadosh. I never walked on the heads of holy people, meaning that here they explain it, in the study hall, I never, because I was a scholar, I was in the front, I never walked on top of people, pushed people aside, stepped over them, probably sitting on the floor to reach my place, because that would have been very rude. V'lo nasati kapai below bracha. And I never said the priestly benediction without saying a blessing beforehand, which, what was so unique about Rabbi Elazar ben Shemuel's behavior? Some explained that he would make a blessing even in cases where he could have relied on the blessing of his peers, since he had already fulfilled the mitzvah once that day. Others suggest that Rabbi Elazar ben Shemuel was referring to various additional blessings that were customary for priests to say following the priestly benediction. Okay. One more. Where are you going? Oh, I think we're going to pause here. We'll pick up Rabbi Parida on Sunday. Sunday's class will be at 1:00 because the unveiling for Maurice Levitt is at 11. So we'll move it to 1:00 and we'll tape that, and hopefully people will be able to enjoy this recording as well. So have a good week, good 3 days until we meet on Sunday.